I'm going to be Honest Abe today and let you know that this message is not going to be 2 minutes long, okay? But it's not going to be 2 hours either. We'll find a happy medium, all right? When Jewish psychiatrist Viktor Frankl was arrested by the Nazis in World War II, he was stripped of everything. Property, family, possessions. He had spent years researching and writing a book on the importance of finding meaning in life. Concepts that later would be known as logotherapy. When he arrived in Auschwitz, the infamous death camp, even his manuscript, which he had hidden in the lining of his coat, was taken away. I had to undergo and overcome the loss of my spiritual child, Frankl wrote. Now it seems as if nothing and no one would survive me, neither a physical nor a spiritual child of my own. I found myself confronted with the question of whether under such circumstances my life was ultimately void of any meaning. He was still wrestling with that question a few days later when the Nazis forced the prisoners to give up their clothes. I had to surrender my clothes and in turn inherited the worn-out rags of an inmate who had been sent to the gas chamber, said Frankl. Instead of many pages of my manuscript, I found in the pocket of the newly acquired coat a single page torn out of a Hebrew prayer book which contained the main Jewish prayer, Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. How should I have interpreted such a coincidence other than as a challenge to live my thoughts instead of merely putting them on paper? Later, as Frankl reflected on his ordeal, he wrote it in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. There is nothing in the world that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is a meaning in one's life. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. Today we continue with the series called Up. Last week we focused on lifted up, the meaning of Jesus' cross. Today our focus is on the meaning of our cross. To kind of get us going in the direction that I want us to take this morning, I want us to go back to something that Viktor Frankl said. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. The primary goal of this message today is to help us understand that we have a why to live for that can only be accomplished through the way of the cross. When Viktor Frankl reached into the pocket of his newly acquired coat, he found a copy of the Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Now, does that sound familiar? How many of you think that sounds familiar? It should, because Jesus was once asked a question, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And this is how Jesus responded. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. When Viktor Frankl read the words of the Shema Yisrael, he discovered he had a why to live for. And when we read the words of Jesus Christ, we discover that we also have a why to live for. The why of our living is the loving of our Lord. That's the why. Our reason for living is to love the Lord with all that we are and all that we have. This is not something we do merely in thought, but in action. Think about how God demonstrated His love for us. Did God merely demonstrate His love for us in thought? No. God demonstrated His love for us in action. Romans 5:8 says, but God demonstrates His own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Calvary was more than a thought. Calvary was action. Calvary was love in action. God demonstrated His love for us by way of the cross, and so we can do no less. The way that we demonstrate our love for the Lord is by way of the cross. Without a cross, there is no demonstration of love. Jesus said it this way in Matthew 16:24. He said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Jesus says, if you want to be like me, if you want to love me as I have loved you, then there is a cross to take up. There is no way to be like me apart from the way of the cross. Now, the rest of this message, I want to share with you what it will mean for us when we take up our cross. It's so very important for us to understand. If we're going to love Jesus like He loved us, and again, the way that God loved us was by way of the cross. If we're going to love Him the way that He loved us, we have to go by way of the cross. And so it's important to understand what that's going to mean for us if we decide to take up a cross and follow Him. And so first, when we take up our cross, it means we will suffer. Look with me at what Matthew writes beginning in chapter 16, verse 21. It says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law. As Jesus drew closer to the cross, Matthew tells us that He began to explain to the disciples that He was going to experience much suffering. In fact, the phrase began to explain, it carries the idea that this was done with explicitness and frequency. This wasn't just a one-time thing where Jesus says, hey guys, come here, I got something to share with you. I'm going to suffer. No, the way that Matthew writes this, it carries the idea that Jesus began to explicitly and frequently gather His disciples around Him to let them know that He was on His way to a cross to not only suffer, but to also die. Jesus left nothing to be implied. He fully and clearly expressed to the disciples over and over and over again that the way of the cross was going to be a way of suffering. I think the reason Jesus was so explicit is because He not only wanted to prepare the disciples for what was going to happen to Him, but I think that Jesus also wanted to prepare the disciples for what was going to happen to them when they made the decision to take up a cross. Follow Him. Jesus wanted them to know if they followed Him in taking up a cross, it would mean suffering for them. You see, suffering is not something we naturally run towards. Suffering is something that we naturally run away from. I mean, no one got up today saying, you know what, I hope I suffer today. I mean, if you know that suffering is in your path, the most natural thing to do is to run away from it. We try to insulate our lives and to protect ourselves from suffering. And so it's a very natural thing to do. We do everything we can to keep from suffering, from coming to us, and also from those that we love. I mean, as a parent, I mean, I do everything I can, humanly speaking, to protect my children from any suffering. I don't want them to suffer. But I also know I can only do so much because suffering is a part of this life. And so I don't like to suffer, and I don't like to see those that I love suffer. We kind of see Peter's response to Jesus. It kind of highlights this reality that we will do everything we can to keep those that we love from suffering. Notice what happens immediately after Jesus explains the inevitable suffering that was coming to Him. Matthew writes, look with me at verse 22. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Imagine that. Peter is rebuking Jesus. The disciple is rebuking the teacher. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. There was no way that Peter was going to allow Jesus to experience suffering if he had anything to do with it. Suffering was not in the mind of Peter for his Christ. And such a mindset brought a sharp rebuke from Jesus. Matthew writes in verse 23, Jesus turned and said to him, Peter, get behind me. Get behind me. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Peter's problem was that he was thinking like a man instead of thinking like Christ. And as a result, he was being used by Satan as a stumbling block in Jesus' life. You see, Satan, he didn't want Jesus to suffer because you know what? Satan knew something. Satan knew that Jesus' suffering would result in the glory of God. And so he uses Peter to try to get Jesus from going to the cross because Satan understood that the cross would mean the glory of God. And Satan's not about the glory of God. Satan's about the glory of himself. And so he will do everything he can to keep people from going to the cross because the cross is a place of glory. It's a way of suffering, but it's also a way of glory. And so he begins to try to influence the mind of Peter to say to Jesus, no, this is never going to happen. You're not going to suffer in that way. I will not stand for it. Today we need to understand that the suffering of the cross of Christ always results in the glory of God, and Satan will influence our thinking against it. Satan wants our mindset to be, I'm never going to take up the cross of suffering. I'm never going to do it. But here's what we need to understand. Unless we are willing to take up the cross of suffering, we will never fulfill the Lord's will to the glory of God. See, the decision to take up the cross of Christ is a decision to take up the suffering of Christ. And that is why so many decide not to take up the cross and follow Jesus. Because again, our natural mindset is to do everything we can to protect ourselves from suffering. But that's not the way of God. God never said, if you follow me, you'll never suffer. In fact, God's pretty clear, I think, throughout His Word that if we follow Him, we will suffer. Martin Luther once said, a religion that gives nothing, costs nothing, and suffers nothing is worth nothing. You turn that statement around and it describes what Jesus demands out of you and me if we want to follow Him. A religion that gives something, costs something, and suffers something is worth something. So let me just ask you today, what is your religion worth? And I don't really like that word religion too much because of everything that tends to be associated with it. I prefer to maybe ask it this way. What's your relationship worth? What's your relationship with Jesus worth? Is it worth nothing? Or is it worth something? Taking up the cross of Christ is a matter of giving something, costing something, and suffering something. But I'm going to tell you something. It's worth something. The glory of God. As we take up the cross of Christ, we make the name of our God more famous. So when we take up our cross, it means we're going to suffer. But don't let that keep you from taking up the cross. If you want your life to truly be a life that glorifies God, the only way that's going to happen is by way of the cross. You have to take up the cross and follow Jesus. So when we take up our cross, it means we will suffer. Second, when we take up our cross, it means we will die. You know it's impossible to take up a cross and not experience death? The cross of Jesus Christ always has and always will result in death. In verse 21, Jesus told his disciples not only that he was going to suffer, but that he was also going to die. Now, when Jesus told his disciples he was going to die, he was speaking of physical death. Jesus literally died on the cross. When his body was taken down from the cross, there was no life in it. You say, well, Pastor, are you saying that if I take up the cross, I'm going to be put to death physically? Not necessarily, but I'm saying it's a possibility. You see, when someone decides to take up their cross and follow Jesus, the end result may be that they find themselves in life-threatening situations. Following Jesus never has been, it never will be a guaranteed safe proposition. Mark Batterson, in his book, All In, this is what he says. The will of God is not an insurance plan. It's a daring plan. The complete surrender of your life to the cause of Christ isn't radical, it's normal. You know there's a life risk in taking up the cross and following Jesus? There's a life risk. But as we will see very shortly, the reward far outweighs the risk. 10 out of the 12 disciples that heard Jesus Christ originally speak these words all died a martyr's death as a result of taking up the cross and following Jesus. 10 out of 12. Minus John, minus Judas, who betrayed Jesus. But the other 10, history tells us, that when they said, I'm going to follow Jesus, I'm going to take up my cross and follow him, the history tells us that 10 of them died a martyr's death. Following Jesus might result in some life-threatening situations. Anyone who decides to follow after Jesus and take up the cross is making a decision to die. And again, I'm not saying the decision to follow after Jesus and take up the cross will necessarily result in physical death, but the possibility is there. And we don't see it so much in our nation, but I want to tell you there are people all over the world today, they are experiencing what I'm talking about. They have made the decision that they're going to follow Jesus and their life is at risk every single hour of every single day. If they're found out, they will be put to death. For the simple reason that they're following Jesus. Not so much in America. We're protected from that now. I think there have been people die here in our land because of the fact that they are following Jesus Christ. But I want to tell you something. Sometimes Jesus may say to you, hey, I want you to follow me over to that country where your life may be at risk. Are you willing to go? Are you willing to follow me even into that life-threatening situation? Because when we decide to take up the cross, we're making a decision to die. The call of Jesus Christ to take up the cross is a call to die to self. And when a person dies to self, the possibilities are endless. Jesus looked at his disciples and he said, as recorded in verse 24, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. The word that Jesus uses here for deny is a word that means to forget oneself, to lose sight of oneself and one's own interests. Selfish people live for themselves. Selfless people, they live for others. In calling us to take up the cross and follow him, Jesus is calling us to die to self and live for him, just as he died to self for us. Dying to self is the only way that we can live for Jesus and be like Jesus. Paul said it this way in Romans 6, beginning in verse 11. He said, in the same way, count yourselves dead. Count yourselves dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body so that you obey its evil desires. Do not offer the parts of your body to sin as instruments of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life. And then Paul, he said it this way in Galatians 2:20. He says, I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live. You know what he's saying? I've died to self. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me. How did he love me? By giving up himself for me. Paul says, Jesus Christ loved me and gave himself up for me, and so I'm going to love him, and I'm going to give myself up for him. I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live. I've taken up my cross, and I'm following Jesus. Today, it's so important for us to understand that before we can ever experience the life of Christ, we must first experience the death of self. To refuse to die to self is to refuse the life that Jesus Christ came to give us. And what good is it? And what good is that to us when all is said and done? Jesus said to the disciples in verses 25 and 26, "For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul?" If we want to find the life of Jesus Christ, the life that he has for us, it comes by way of dying to self and surrendering our heart to Jesus. There is nothing in this world worth gaining at the expense of what we will forfeit by not laying our hearts down in surrender. And I think our society needs to hear that. There is nothing in this world worth gaining at the expense of what we will forfeit by not laying our hearts down in surrender. Nothing. All this world has to offer, you know it's going to burn up someday. You realize that, right? This world is not going to last forever. And it's going to be destroyed. And if we have spent our life on this earth making that our priority, we have gained absolutely nothing. Every seed has life in it. I mean, we're getting ready for, people are starting to plant gardens, and they're starting to plant all these seeds, flower seeds. And every one of those seeds has life in it. But there's only one way for that life to spring forth. And that is for the seed to first be planted in death. And we are like seeds. We have life in us. We have God's life in us. And the only way for that life to spring forth is for us to first be planted in death. And it's only as we die to self that we can live for Jesus. It's only as we die to self that we can truly experience the life that God has for us. As I mentioned earlier, there's a life risk in taking up a cross and following Jesus, but the reward, it far outweighs the risk. Can you imagine the farmer saying, "Oh, there's no way I'm going to plant this seed"? I mean, there's a risk involved. There's a risk involved for a farmer to go out and just plant one seed. But if he refuses to plant that one seed, he'll never discover the reward that lies in that one seed when it's planted in death. And what is that reward? A harvest. Harvest. So there is risk. But the reward of dying is to truly find the life of Jesus Christ and to bear the fruit of righteousness. So let me just ask you today. Have you ever died? have you ever died? Listen, if you've never died, then you've never lived. If you've never died, you've never experienced the life that Jesus Christ, that abundant life. You know, Jesus Christ said, the thief comes only to steal and to kill and to destroy. You know one of the ways that the thief steals from us? By convincing us it's not worth it to die to self. But Jesus says, I've come that you might have life, abundant life. And the only way that abundant life can be experienced is when we are willing to die to self so that we can truly experience the life that God has for us. We live in such a secularized society. We do. It's such a secular society we live in. Even in the time that I have gone from being a child to where I'm at today, it is amazing how secular we've become. Our kids are faced with decisions that we weren't faced with. But I want to tell you something. We have to encourage our kids to stand up to secular society and says just because society says this is the way to go doesn't mean it's the way to go. My kids are likely to be the ones that are going to get picked on. Because I want them to know who comes first in their life. And it's Jesus. It's Jesus Christ. I want to tell you something today. Listen, there is nothing in this world that matters most than my kids' relationship with Jesus Christ. It's what's going to stand for all eternity. They're going to forfeit some things in this life. They're going to have to make some decisions and give up some things because Jesus Christ says, come and die to follow me. And if I don't teach them young, they're not going to do it when they're old. Are they going to have some tough conversations with some people in life? Yes. But I want to tell you, it's worth it. It's worth it. There were some things I had to give up. My brother's here today. We had to give up some things, didn't we? You realize that we live in a much more relaxed society today than we did back when we were growing up. Technology's better. But you know, how old were you when you first saw your first Super Bowl? I mean, we were at church. We didn't get to stay at home. We had to go to church, and we had to be there. You were probably well up in your high school years before you ever got to see a live Super Bowl on TV. But you know, I don't know what kind of effect that had on my siblings, but I'm going to tell you, I'm glad that my mom and dad said, you're going to be there. Because I'm going to tell you, those Super Bowls are overrated. Except for the first one and I think the third one. And they were all pretty good, but ever since that time, they've all been overrated. You can go look up and see who was in the first one. Huh? No, they didn't. I'm hearing white noise. But it's so important. Adults, it isn't just our children. We're faced with decisions. Are we going to put Jesus Christ first? Are we going to put the things that He says are important in our life? Are we going to put those things first? I've not been at this as long as some pastors, but I can tell you, I've been at this about 15 years now, and I can tell you it is getting harder and harder in our secular society to compete. It is. God forbid, I mean, if I make it to 65, nearly 70, as a pastor, I don't know what it's going to be like then. if we don't begin to die to self and live for Jesus. Some of you are beginning to wonder, I think he's getting close to that 2-hour mark. It seems like it. We're not there yet, friends. I'm closing things up. Finally, I want you to see, when we take up the cross, it means we will suffer, it means we will die, but it means we'll win. How many of you want to be winners? I don't know anybody wants to be a loser. Again, you don't get up, you do not get up and say you want to suffer, but you also don't get up and say, I want to be a loser. Jesus says to his disciples in verse 27, for the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he's done. A day is coming when each of us will give an account for what we've done with the life that we've been given by God. Paul, he writes in 2 Corinthians 5:10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. Now I want you to understand that Jesus and Paul are both speaking to those who have believed in Jesus Christ. The judgment seat of Christ is not a place where a believer's sin is going to be judged, because their sin has already been judged at Calvary. That's what the cross is all about. Jesus Christ, he took our place. He bore upon himself the judgment of our sin. The judgment seat of Christ is not a place where a believer's sin is going to be judged. The judgment seat of Christ is a place where a believer's life is going to be judged. The judgment seat of Christ is a place where a believer is going to be rewarded for what they have done while in the body. Did we live for ourselves, which is bad, or did we live for Jesus Christ, which is good? Today we need to understand that when we refuse to take up the cross and live for ourselves, we lose. But when we choose to take up the cross and live for Jesus Christ, we win. Eternal reward is given to those who take up the cross and follow Jesus. Charles Spurgeon said, there are no crown wearers in heaven who were not cross bearers below. So when we take up the cross and follow Jesus, we win, and winners are always rewarded. Always. Losers are not. You realize that. Now, again, we live in a society where we're kind of trying to go that way. But history, if you look at history, for the most part, it's winners who are rewarded. Paul wrote this. He said in 1 Corinthians 9:24-25, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last. Again, it's going to perish. I ran yesterday and I got a medal because there's only 3 people in my division. I don't care to tell. I was just glad to take a medal home. But I want to tell you, when I get to heaven, I won't be wearing that medal. It doesn't last. Listen to what Paul says. He says, they do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Today I want to encourage you to run in such a way as to get the prize. Discipline yourself to be a disciple of Jesus. Deny yourself. Take up your cross. Follow Jesus. And when you do that, you will win, and you will be given a reward that will last forever. So when we take up the cross to follow Jesus, you know what we're saying? This is so important. When we take up the cross and follow Jesus, we are saying, I love his life more than I love my life. That's what we're saying. And that's a win, folks. That's a win. We can't lose when we follow Jesus, and we can't win when we go our own way and do our own thing. So let me ask you today, are you running in such a way to win the prize? Or are you taking up a cross daily and following Jesus? Today my prayer is that you will be persuaded by the power of the Holy Spirit to take up the cross and suffer and die and win, so that you will experience glory and life and reward. And so during this time of invitation, be persuaded. Be persuaded to do what God has been speaking to your heart to do. Every head bowed, every eye closed, nobody looking around. Let me just ask you today, what is it? What is it that you need to die to today so that you can truly experience a life of Jesus, so that you can truly experience what He has for you? What is it that you need to die to today so that you can live for Him, so that you can glorify Him with your life?